victims differ from time to time, but each acts in a similar manner, and with similar human physical traits. But they're more reminiscent of beasts of burden, even though I can spot some flicker of humanity, with scars and marks on their skin and body, as if they ever been self-mutilating. They even look dead. I fail to see humanity in them. They are bent on finding me, but somehow they refrain from killing me. Instead, I'm hung from one of those dreadful hooks. I keep asking myself why they don't snuff the life out of me themselves, but someone must control them. A pair of conjoined twins, Charlotte and Victor Deschays, formed an emotional bond like none other. The unlikeliness of their successful birth in the 17th century could be described as miraculous, yet it immediately brought about their life of persecution. The twins emerged with Victor's lower body affixed into the chest of his sister, legs twisted around her muscles and organs. He was smaller than Charlotte, grown as if he were an appendage of her body rather than a fully formed boy. As the newborns screeched, so too did the midwife who delivered them, running from the home, yelling of a demon birthed by a witch. So began the hunting of Charlotte, Victor, and their mother Madeline. The coming years were fleeting memories for the twins, yet they were the closest thing to a normal life they would know. The journey with their mother was what they believed all children underwent. The games of running and hiding through France's countryside being an ordinary occurrence. At the age of 5, a new challenge to the game was presented as their mother fell ill. Pale and exhausted, Madeline had no choice but to pass responsibility of collecting food onto Charlotte. The girl, burdened under extra clothing that concealed Victor's protruding body, set out from their forest tent and marched to the nearby town. Though a peculiar sight, she did what she'd been trained for, waiting for an opening at the market and swiping whatever food she could. It was a victory in the game, but one short-lived. After midnight, glowing flames surrounded the family's encampment, bobbing through the darkness. A single commanding shout broke the night's silence, and a mob of witch hunters streamed in. Grubby hands tore the twins from their bed, Charlotte frantically kicking all who approached. Madeline cried for her children, her voice abruptly silenced by a club to her skull. Victor shrieked, the wailing of a trapped rat. The hunters coordinated quickly. A judge on hand declared Madeline guilty of witchcraft, evidenced by her demon spawn. Within minutes, they shackled her unconscious body to a tree, surrounding her feet with dry twigs and moss. As she awoke, she did not struggle, only begged her children to turn away. They would be given no choice. The twins were forced to watch as the torch was lit, and they watched as flames leapt up their mother's skirt, charring and sizzling her flesh. They watched as fat dripped from her body and her face bubbled and twisted. They watched until the screams that tore her vocal cords were no more, and all that was left was the crackling of embers and a nauseating stench. Whatever joy and goodness were in them died with their mother. Caged and transported to an old wooden temple, they were sold to a secretive group clad in dark cloaks. Victor reacted with the ferocity of a rabid beast at anyone who approached, clawing and biting. The only solace that could calm him was the embrace of his sister. Charlotte, bitter and hateful to all but her brother, found purpose in being his protector. Within the temple, they were exposed to unusual experiments, some cruel, many simply baffling. One day they would be made to break the neck of a small grey bird. The next they would lead their fingers into a vase of roses. Every 7th day, they would sleep with the branch of a damp oak beneath their pillow. Then there was the chanting, a never-ending chorus from cloaked figures on scheduled intervals. In time, a final experiment was planned. 2 robed figures herded the twins to the center of the temple, holding Charlotte upon an altar in a room lit with candelabras. The wrinkled face of a man peered from under his hood, placing a hand on the forehead of each twin, making careful examination of their skulls. "Memento mori," he uttered as he withdrew a shining blade. Charlotte rolled to her side, shifting her brother off the altar. With a screech, he stretched his arm as far as he could, knocking a candelabra to the ground. The flames took to the dry wood immediately. They swept over the floor, igniting the black robes that brushed against it. Screams of agony pierced the chaos, invigorating Charlotte. She dashed through the inferno, vision concealed with nothing but black smoke and blazing flame. A painful heaviness filled her lungs. No exit could be found, every step leading to overwhelming heat. She fell to her knees, suffocating, then saw it. Sunlight, trees. She stumbled from the fire into dewy grass. Without looking back, she ran into the forest until she collapsed. When Charlotte opened her eyes, she reached for Victor's hand. He made no attempt to budge. His body hung helplessly from her torso. She clasped his face, stared into his sad, still eyes, the movements she was accustomed to, his body pulling at her skin, his legs prodding at the cavity in her chest, were no more. Victor was dead. Charlotte had no choice but to continue moving as she mourned, fearing black cloaks and witch hunters were prowling. She concealed her brother's corpse under her clothing and marched for the sewers of a nearby city. There she set up camp, emerging often to steal whatever food she could, resorting to raiding barns for pig slop when desperation set in. Throughout the years, Victor's corpse rotted as his limbs oozed and blackened, yet his body demonstrated resistance to complete decomposition, as if his sister's blood still coursed through him. Protecting his lifeless body became Charlotte's sole reason for being, refusing to ever be separated from the only family she had left. Life into her teenage years was a game of survival. Her hatred for humanity grew each day under the realization that they would never leave her be. No matter how many died during her botched robberies and desperate attempts to escape, there would always be more to pursue and sling words of condemnation at her. Monster, demon, witch, and it was the Black Cloaks who were the worst of them. The hunt for her was unending, forcing her to constantly abandon shelter and run. For years, Charlotte fled, drawing blood out of necessity, cradling her long-dead brother in the night. During a frigid winter, her body began to break down. Food was scarce and the refuge of rickety shacks were no use against the freezing temperatures. Sickle in hand, she sheltered near her campfire in the woods, not knowing if the Black Cloaks would take her before the cold did. As frost crystallized around her nostrils and lips took on gentle blue hue, Charlotte felt something she had never experienced: acceptance. She closed her eyes, opening herself to the serenity of death when a shriek, shrill and vicious, pierced her ears. Victor spasmed and flailed from her chest, a cloud of fog encompassing him. Before she could react, he spilled from her in a bloody puddle, landing on the snow, and running. Pulling herself from the edge of death, she gave chase. Calling his name, she ran through the forest until her legs could hardly carry her, until finally, within her view, was Victor, sitting at the edge of a thick fog, his gaze twisted and feral. Screamed as a dark hooded figure emerged from the fog, grabbed his arm and seized him. The serenity that had crept into Charlotte was extinguished, replaced with the seething hatred and rage she had depended on for so long. With a tight grip on her sickle, she charged into the fog, prepared to eviscerate any who set foot near her brother. Ji-woon Hak thrived under the attention of others, energized by every eye that watched him and every tongue that spoke his name. Amidst the prestige, he had only one desire: more. Even as a child, he found ways to draw crowds. Working at his family's restaurant, he attracted business with spectacles he performed using throwing knives. Gullible tourists believed this was a traditional South Korean experience, gladly parting with their money to witness it. Ji-woon's father spent the restaurant's earnings on dancing and vocal lessons for his son, pushing him to attain the fame he never could. Ji-woon did not disappoint. After years showcasing his abilities to nobodies at talent shows, he hit the track to stardom. Yunjin Lee, a producer at Mighty One Entertainment, recruited Ji-woon into her training program. He transferred to a dormitory in Seoul where, for 14 hours a day, he was crafted into a star, taught how to move and sing, how to carry himself with the right balance of confidence and modesty. Draining as the process was, it worked. Yunjin selected Ji-woon to join the band No Spin, bringing a raw energy to their tracks. Fame was almost immediate. Ji-woon lived in a daze of interviews and adoration, and though the frenzied schedule exhausted his bandmates, he was invigorated. Each day was an affirmation that he was greater than the mediocrity society spewed out. But over time, the champagne grew stale. When he looked at his fans, he saw their joy and envy split 5 ways, thinned out between each band member. The validation that had surged through him left a desperate yearning for more. Ji-woon kept up impressions, mimicking a charm long buried under loathing. He recorded the latest No Spin album with his bandmates, never missing a beat. After a lengthy lunch break, he returned to the studio to discover fate had granted him a gift. The scent of burning wires was unmistakable. He rushed to the control room, finding the door blocked by fallen speakers. On the other side, his bandmates pounded on the door, their cries accompanied by the crackling of flames. Ji-woon called to them, dashing to the speakers, grabbing one and stopping. He froze. Each breath was a conscious, deliberate process requiring all his attention. The nearby cries, hardly audible until, slowly, he backed away. And then he heard it. They were screaming his name as they burned, screaming for him to save them. Ji-woon, Ji-woon, Ji-woon Hak. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. When the fire crew arrived, his tears were genuine. Ji-woon was celebrated as a tragic figure, a hero who did all he could in a futile attempt to save his friends. Yunjin paraded him through interviews until it was time to rebrand. He was reborn as the Trickster, a solo artist who produced his own songs, sporting a soft heart beneath a wild exterior. But away from concert setups and television stages, something darker grew. He targeted those who lived alone, coming to them in the night. The first was a college music student with a captivating voice. Ji-woon woke him with a baseball bat to the skull, binding his arms and legs, gagging him with a rag duct taped into his mouth. He tortured him for hours, dissecting him alive. Yet there was something missing, a sound, a connection. He wanted to hear the victim's wondrous voice, pleading as he cut his belly open, but all he received was muffled cries through a rag. He learned and adjusted. Victims had to be abducted, driven to an abandoned building where he could let their voices carry unrestrained emotion. He made music from them, prodding in the right places to evoke different types of shrieks and howls. Stabbing the quadratus lumborum elicited a long guttural wail, while slashing the carotid artery created a sound like a cat being strangled. There was honesty in their suffering. Jiwoon recorded each session, synthesizing and working them into his songs, hiding them behind layers of melodies. He was elated with his work. He left hints for police, arranging a mink boa from a recent photo shoot around a victim's slashed throat. For his next killing, he removed the teeth from a man that a boxer in one of his music videos was without, during a particularly audacious plea for attention. He killed a fan he met during a VIP meetup, replacing her eyes with his diamond cufflinks and writing, "I have seen God," in blood across her chest. Each scene was a dazzling spectacle. Between music and murder, Jiwoon's work was discussed globally. However, as violence became his preferred art style, his music career took a hit. Revenue was down, and Mighty One executives pointed their fingers at him. Yeonjin, with professional fury, came to his defense, but she was outnumbered. It was decided that Jiwoon could no longer self-produce his songs. The decision was devastating. His tracks fused genuine humanity into music, yet executives rejected anything that wasn't generic and expected. And so be it. If they couldn't understand his art, he would incorporate them into it until they did. He had 3 months until he was to perform a private show for Mighty One's board members. 3 months to plan his magnum opus. He transferred obscene amounts of money to a veterinarian in exchange for canisters of nitrous oxide, then bribed the stage technician of Mighty One's private theatre for access to the room. His celebrity granted him a benefit of the doubt no regular person could conceive. When the show was ready, gas seeped into the room as executives and stagehands awaited Jiwoon, conveniently running behind schedule. When he arrived, half-conscious bodies were splayed in their seats and crawling across the floor. He worked quickly, binding everyone, pausing only when he came to Yeonjin, the woman who had plucked him from a mud hole and set him on the path he deserved. She would be rewarded, granted special access to the coming display of wonder. Even under sedation, she fought, a raging storm within her, far stronger than the others. He propped her up as the lone audience member, prying her eyes open. The others, sniveling and sobbing, were brought on stage to perform their final act. With a contemptible sneer, he slapped makeup onto their faces and shone stage lights upon them. They became his instruments. To the sound of self-produced melodies, he tortured them, gracefully dashing from one body to another, conducting an operatic crescendo from their wailings. They shouted, whimpered, screamed, cried for their loved ones, cried for their mothers. It was a magnificent outpouring of emotion, of what it meant to be human. And they did it with their eyes fixed on Jiwoon. Viscera drained from the stage until, with the toss of his throwing knife, the final human instrument fell silent and the music stopped. Covered in sweat and blood, an exhausted Jiwoon looked to Yeonjin and bowed. Curtain call. He had attained perfection. With blade in hand, he made his way to Yeonjin, prepared to tie up loose ends before the credits rolled, but as he reached her, the fog, from where he didn't know, but it billowed around them, damp, cool, comfortable. He saw the grand stage, hospitals and temples, forests and slaughterhouses, an eternal plain adorned with rusted hooks, sustained by the millions of eyes that would watch him, run from him, experience him. All he had to do was accept, become an implement of the fog, and, more importantly, make them scream. Encore. Designed by the Umbrella Corporation, the Nemesis is a nearly unstoppable, bioorganic weapon fixated on pursuing and eliminating its targets. Part of the Tyrant T-103 series, the specimen has increased intelligence and awareness due to the neoparasite implanted within it. Its first mission unleashed it upon Raccoon City, where it had a singular objective: exterminate STARS members. Rampaging through the city, the Nemesis faced off against Jill Valentine multiple times, and though she managed to escape, he was never far behind. He nearly had his target when a strange fog descended upon them. Mixing with the smoke of a city in chaos, the phenomenon meant nothing to him, the frigid cold and decreased oxygen never posing a threat. All that mattered was soldiering on into the fog, continuing the mission. Find STARS, exterminate STARS, and kill anyone who gets in the way. A demon to some, an angel to others. Pinhead is an explorer in the further regions of experience, indulging in the limitless thrill of pleasure and pain. When the puzzle box known as the Lament configuration, a key to another dimension, was found in the entity's realm, it was only a matter of time before it fell into curious hands. Once opened, he arrived. What came next was sweet suffering that spilled over the realm.
Carmina Mora was a gifted artist who carried the guilt of her young brother's death. Growing up a rugged coastal village in southern Chile, she sketched the sublime landscapes of Patagonia. Sitting outside, she painted dramatic fjords while feeding the crows nested in the tree next to her house. She grew up carrying the guilt of her mother's sudden departure. Her father blamed Carmina for her mother's abandonment, which added to her grief. She became the caretaker of Matthias, her little brother, despite still being a child herself. A year later, Carmina was painting with Matthias outside when the telephone rang. Her father remained in the yard, drinking his beer. Carmina rushed to the house to answer the phone and hung up a few seconds later. When she returned outside, Matthias was nowhere to be seen. She asked her father, but he had paid no attention to Matthias. She called her brother's name, looking for him everywhere. While searching, she saw a bright red coat floating on the narrow creek by the house, Matthias's jacket. She jumped into the creek and found him floating on the surface with vacant eyes, unblinking. He had fallen and drowned. A scream tore the sky. Her father found Carmina sobbing on the creek's shore, clutching her brother's body in her arms, surrounded by a murder of crows. Her father snatched Matthias's body away from her, and she cried until her voice broke. The following morning, the world was cloaked in darkness. Her father did not say a word, because he did not have to. Carmina knew it was all her fault. Months passed, yet her loss was as fresh as morning dew. Crippled with self-loathing, she could no longer paint. Without Matthias, life had no meaning. On the bleak morning of Matthias's birthday, Carmina walked to a narrow bridge several blocks away from her home. She was convinced that nothing could bring her relief. Her mother was gone. Her brother was dead. And her father blamed her for it all. She was convinced that she had nothing left to live for. Carmina walked to the railing of the bridge that stood over the turbulent river. Locals had nicknamed the spot Death Leap. Several cars drove by Carmina, but none stopped. No one seemed to care. She climbed over the railings, and her legs wobbled as she stood on the lip of the bridge. She looked down, watching the fierce river smash into a giant boulder. She closed her eyes. "See you soon, Matthias." Suddenly, a cacophony of caws filled the sky. Carmina opened her eyes and saw a black cloud of feathers flying towards her. The cloud split open and glossy black crows dove from the sky, One landed on her shoulder and stared intently into Carmina's eyes, as if peering into her soul. Her grip on the railing loosened, and the crow cawed raucously. Carmina stared at the crow, confused. Another crow landed on the railing, then another. Soon a flock of crows were covering the railing of the bridge, staying close to her. She felt their heavy stare on her, calculative and enigmatic, as if they were assessing her. She looked down for a second, and a thunder of caws interrupted her dark impulse. The crow seemed to care about her well-being. As she dangled over the edge with the wind blowing through her raven hair, Carmina felt akin to them. For the first time since Matthias had died, Carmina did not feel alone. She returned home, giving life another chance. The crows left, but Carmina suspected that if anything happened to her, they would return. Inspired by her ordeal, Carmina picked up a brush. In the weeks that followed, she painted her experience, using black ink to depict the death leap, with a black cloud of feathers, the murder of crows that saved her life. The experience was transformative and launched her signature black ink surrealist art. After several years, some color pierced the darkness, and this shift of medium expanded her art form. She painted large-scale murals on busy street corners, designed grandiose costumes, and recited militant poetry. Carmina's art displayed local, intimate tragedies on a large scale, making them impossible to ignore, and everywhere she performed, crows followed. Her performances grew bold and drew the attention of artists who found her style invigorating. She grew close to a group of painters who understood her iconoclastic vision. Her performances launched the large-scale surrealist movement, which became a phenomenon. Her renown grew enough to attract the commission of a multinational enterprise, the VAC label. Carmina investigated the group, discovering that they gifted art pieces to select disreputable congressmen. VAC's commissioned artists seemed to disappear afterwards. Determined to expose the group's link to corrupt politics, Carmina accepted VAC's commission. The following week, Carmina painted a giant mural on a cemetery's columbarium, displaying the VAC label logo as a surrealist Grim Reaper harvesting the fields of Chilean families. She wore a theatrical dress as she painted, on which she had stitched a poem about political revolution. The piece sparked a radical debate about corruption. The controversy painted a target on Carmina's back. After receiving an anonymous death threat, she took refuge in her father's house, bringing along her closest friends for safety. That night, a gang of masked gunmen broke into the house. They swiftly subdued Carmina and her friends, threw them in a van, and drove off. The following morning, a dry breeze blew sand on Carmina's face, awakening her. She was seated in a chair in the middle of the desert, with her legs tied and her hands handcuffed. Her friends were lying on the ground, tied up. A shadow fell over her face. Carmina looked up. A man dressed in a long robe with his face hidden in a dark hood approached her. He pulled a silvery knife from his robe. He grabbed her hands and recited a hymn in an unfamiliar language. Carmina held his gaze. He paused and brought down his blade with a sudden blow. She cried in agony as her friends woke to a terrible sight. Carmina's severed hands falling in the sand. The hooded man smiled in satisfaction. "How are you going to paint now?" Carmina cursed and screamed at him, wriggling against her bonds. The man grabbed Carmina's chin. She spat in his face. He grunted and pried her mouth open, pulling out her tongue. Carmina struggled against her handcuffs. In a violent blow, he chopped off Carmina's tongue. She howled in anguish. The man wiped his blade on his robe, leaving a trail of blood. "How are you going to recite poems now?" Sorrow swelled in Carmina's chest, sharper than pain. Overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage, grief and loss overcame her senses. She had lost her little brother. She had lost the only way to cope with such pain. Carmina screamed like on the day her brother died. Raucous calls echoed through the wasteland. The sky was obscured by a cyclone of dark clouds. Black feathers fell on Carmina's bleeding arms. She looked up and saw a torrent of crows erupting from the clouds, diving on the hooded man. As the ravenous crows pecked at his flesh mercilessly, Carmina smiled, watching her surrealist art coming to life. But her heart lurched with rage when she saw the crows move on to their next target, her friends on the ground. She screamed as waves of pain, guilt, and fright overwhelmed her. But it was in vain. The ravenous crows were uncontrollable. Darkness fell over her eyes as her friends' agonizing screams grew more acute. Death was coming, and again, it was her fault. A deep, black fog engulfed her.
Hey everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you again to everyone who's tuned in to listen to this entire series. It's something I've wanted to do for a while, and I've wanted to branch out into more voiceover, voice acting stuff for a little while now. So this was sort of my introduction into it. If you guys enjoyed it, then please feel free to let me know. Any positive reinforcement is always nice. And I'm sorry that I couldn't drop something a little bit bigger for the end of the year. It's been a very busy couple of weeks for me. I've had a lot of things to do for college. I've had work to do as far as coming back home. I'm back with my family now, so hopefully I'll be able to stream again because the internet's better here. And I have a plan for how I want to go about things next year, try and expand. I'm thinking of maybe starting off a little, either a second channel for voice acting stuff, or making an extended video or like a mini series on this channel dedicated to the phone guy from Five Nights at Freddy's as my next voice acting project, because that's something that I think I could do pretty well. Like, not necessarily just the phone guy, but like all of the voice acted characters from the main series, not counting Ultimate Custom Night. Because I think I could give it a good go and it show off some diversity. So yeah, I think I'm going to try and expand in that direction for next year, as well as putting out more stuff. Like I normally do, more montages, gameplay videos. I'm going to try and get more stuff sorted out, because I think from what I've heard, the hardest work in my course is behind me now. So I should have a little bit more free time on my hands once the January exams that I have are out of the way. But enough about me. Thank you guys again so much for this year. All the support's been so good. I've been making content for just over a year now, and we've already reached the triple digits on both my platforms, which is insane. And I'm not going to go about trying to make goals for next year, because all I want is to keep working hard and making good stuff. So anyone who's tuned in at all this year, thank you. I will see if I can get something proper out for the end of the year, combining some of my best bits maybe. We'll see what happens. In case I don't, have a happy new year everyone. I think we all hope and deserve for better next year. So hopefully 2022 is a nice break from all the shit that's been going on this year. Stay safe everyone. You guys mean so much to me. Have a good day.